Good morning everyone, Rooster here with some exciting Hearthstone news. First of all, if you haven't heard already, Whispers of the Old Gods will hit next week on the 26th or 27th of April, depending on where you live in the world, of course. It will hit slightly sooner for the Americas and Europe and Asia. The expansion will hit on the 27th. Probably all on the same time, but that has not yet been confirmed. Without further ado, an article was just posted, I think just an hour ago, on the Blizzard website, the Hearthstone subsite, of course. An article called Keeping Hearthstone Fresh. And this is the long-awaited article about the nerfs to basic and classic cards that everyone's been waiting for. For quite some time now. Of course, new card releases should have an impact on Standard and Enriched Wild, and to make sure that Hearthstone is always as dynamic, fresh, and fun as it can be. And that is the guideline that Blizzard follows for the nerfs of these cards, and I thought I'd give you my input on them, as well as just make you aware of these. Before we go further, this will likely mean that these cards can be disenchanted. Of course, the cards within the classic set will be able to be disenchanted at full value, so hold on to your classic boosters, or at least the cards from within for now. So, for example, if you do this week's Tavern Brawl, be careful with what cards you're immediately disenchanting, because in a week you'll be able to disenchant these for full value. So without further ado, we start with the Druid cards, and first of all, Ancient of Lore, which has been changed from choose one, draw 2 cards, or restore 5 health, to choose one, draw a card, or restore 5 health. And this is a pretty big one. Ancient of Lore is basically a staple in any kind of mid-range or slower Druid deck. So basically the mid-range Druid, the ramp Druid, the really slow Druids perhaps even. They all win this card because a 7 mana 5/5 which draws 2 cards is actually pretty great. And having the option of having a 7 mana 5/5 that restores 5 health is just gravy on top. And now this card is more of an actual choice whether you want to include this card in your deck. Because a 7 mana 5/5 draw card is actually not that amazing. It's not a bad card, but compare this to Azure Drake, for example, a 5 mana 4/4 draw card, and spell power +1. It's not that much better than Azure Drake if you purely evaluate this card based on you basically always drawing a card when you play it. But do keep in mind that that Druid cards with choose one provide you with options. So you should only want to include this deck if both options are actually used. So if you plan on always casting Ancient of Lore for drawing 2 cards, which is 90% of cases, you're only really considering to use Ancient of Lore to heal your face either in very, very slow matchups where you don't want to draw the cards, or when you're up against a hyper-aggressive deck, but in that case you're probably going to lose anyway, and it always feels bad whenever you have to heal your face to survive. So those situations will be reduced, but this card should no longer be an auto include in any slow-ish Druid deck. And with that, you probably can read the next line, Force of Nature, which is a very hotly contested card, so let's go take a look at it. Force of Nature is changed from summoning 3/2/2 Treants with charge that die at the end of turn, to summoning 3/2/2 Treants, and to compensate, because that would make for a really bad card, this card now costs 5 mana instead of 6. So this really keeps any combo potential out of the realm of possibilities for this card. The old Force of Nature Savage Roar combo is no longer there. We no longer have to fear the number 14 whenever we face a druid, because that's just no longer any real danger. So is this card playable? It might be. It's kind of a decent rate. It's not too spectacular. Token druid decks like the ones running Power of the Wild or the like might consider still playing this card. It's not a bad card, and if you combo it with Violet Teacher and Power of the Wild, it might be somewhat decent. But the real question here is what happens to mid-range druids? Well, with these changes, at least mid-range druid loses its combo, so we might see mid-range druids revert to more of a ramp druid style, perhaps even including Astral Communion, which is also an interesting deck. They might run Nourish instead of Ancient of Lore, perhaps using one copy of each, one Ancient of Lore, one Nourish. And just making Druid about ramping to really big stuff. And on the other side, we have the other kind of Druid decks, like the Egg Druid, which of course loses Nerubian Egg in Standard, or the more aggressive versions of Druid, like Aggro Druid, using the Raptor, using kind of sticky-ish minions, and then casting Savage Roar, because Savage Roar is actually untouched. So if you leave a druid with some minions on the table, they can still Savage Roar and deal a lot of unexpected damage. Perhaps even including a charge minion instead of the Force of Nature. So that's still a possibility, but druid will never be the same, especially considering the next card, Keeper of the Grove. I'll try and not spoil the next card from now on, so Keeper of the Grove is changed from a 4-mana 2/4, choose one, deal 2 damage, or silence a minion, to a 4-mana 2/2 with the same text. So again, same story really. Perhaps even more so than Ancient of Lore. This card was basically an always include card, because a 4-mana 2/4 that deals 2 damage is actually a pretty good card. And a 4-mana 2/4 Silence a Minion is, well, maybe not as good as for example a what's the card? A Spellbreaker, which is a 4-mana 4/3 Silence a Minion. But the flexibility of the card, plus the possibility of playing it as a 4-mana 2/4, which deals 2 damage, which is just probably a bit overrated. So the card was just way too efficient, and basically every single Druid deck, except maybe the most aggressive Egg Druid, Soul of the Forest combo decks, always ran Keepers of the Grove. So this card is hit pretty hard, but considering the next few nerfs, we might still see Keeper of the Grove in Druid decks, at least as a one-off, I think. Because, well, it's not really that useful talking about this card in a vacuum, so let's go on to the next card, and then we'll talk about Keeper a bit after that. So the next card, when we're talking about silence and removal, is Ironbeak Owl. And Ironbeak Owl is, well, spoiler, we're going to talk about BGH next, but let's talk about silence first. So, Ironbeak Owl is changed from a 2-mana to 1 minion to a 3-mana to 1 minion, both of which battlecry silence a minion. So this card was basically seen everywhere. Aggressive decks ran Owl, but also decks like Midrange Paladin, decks that just want a silence effect just ran Ironbeak Owl basically as a freebie. Just to be able to deal with opposing Sylvanuses, to deal with opposing taunts, and silence effects just were a little bit too powerful for the amount of mana that they cost. So now when Ironbeak Owl is a 3-mana 2/1, big note here is that Spellbreaker was not changed. So that's a bit of a strange change here, because you have the choice of if you want a silence effect in your deck and you're not a druid, or perhaps a priest, but I don't really see people playing the 0 mana silence spell. So if you really decide you want a silence effect, for example, midrange paladin really wants a silence effect in his deck, or perhaps warriors. Warriors used to sometimes include an owl or even a spellbreaker in the deck, just because the silence effect was really important. Warlocks too, handlocks or Reno locks really like their silence effects. So they now have the choice of either including owl or Spellbreaker for 1 more mana, which gets +2/+2 in stats. That's a very real choice. So aggressive decks and especially hunter decks might value the mana reduction more, as well as the fact that Owl is a beast, which is not irrelevant, especially for hunters. So that might be a real consideration. I'm not too unhappy about this change here. And it will make aggressive decks think twice about the way they want to pass taunt minions, which is also really relevant. So we might even see an increase in Black Knight being played, for example, which also leads into our next discussion. But let's go back to Keeper of the Grove for a little bit here. We have Keeper of the Grove here, which is now a 2/2 for 4 mana, which can silence a minion, but also has the option of dealing 2 damage to a minion, which is surprisingly relevant, because innervating out a Keeper of the Grove to deal with an opposing Knife Juggler, which, funny enough, is a card we also have to talk about. Druid cards will likely still have merit just based on their flexibility. The importance of a Keeper of the Grove is mostly that it can deal 2 damage to a minion, and then can deal 2 damage again, because it actually leaves something on the board. And innervating out a Keeper of the Grove against an aggressive deck is still very effective, because it will likely deal 2 damage twice, and offer you a board presence which you can then improve upon. For example, you can cast buffs on it. It's not very relevant in Constructed, but it might be in the future. So it's still not a bad card, it's just a little more situational card, and Druids might actually consider, if they're just running Keeper for the silence effect, that they would rather have a 4 mana 4/3 minion instead of a 4 mana 2/2. They lose the access to the 2 damage effect, but if they are already running, for example, 2 copies of Living Roots, they might say, I've already got enough ways to deal 2 damage, I would rather have a decent board presence when I play a 4 mana minion. And that's actually a real choice, so I'm not too unhappy about this change. It feels really harsh, but it should lead to some interesting deck building decisions, and that's the part I like here. So next up is Big Game Hunter. And this is another one of the really big ones that people have started to see coming for quite some time. So Big Game Hunter, a 3 mana 4/2, destroy a minion with attack 7 or more, is now changed to a 5 mana 4/2, Battlecry, destroy a minion with attack 7 or more. And that's fine, because Big Game Hunter has always been a really, really big tempo swing. Because if you play a Ragnaros, for example, well, you've already had your 8 random damage, but then your opponent both removes your 8 mana minion and plays a decently sized minion for 3 mana. Because a 4/2 for 3 mana is not all that embarrassing. and really forces your opponent to actually deal with the 4/2 on the table. So if you're only playing a Nefarian, for example, and your opponent plays a Big Game Hunter to get rid of your Nefarian, your opponent still has a 4/2 on the battlefield, which is actually something you have to deal with, and you can't just hero power down. So the immense tempo swing from Big Game Hunter was something that needed to be dealt with, and I do think this may look pretty huge, but Big Game Hunter is actually still a real card. people will likely not include 2 big game hunters in decks anymore because they might feel really clunky when they don't hit anything. And especially in, for example, Malygos Warlock decks that might have included double Abusive Sergeant to make their big game hunters hit more likely. I don't think we'll see double big game hunters, but owning 1 big game hunter will very likely be very, very viable in a great variety of decks. We might see less big game hunters in decks that don't usually run them. So, for example, you have decks like Oil Rogue, or Oil Rogue is another beast that we'll tackle a bit later. But certain rogue decks, for example, or certain aggressive decks, we've even seen zoo decks that run Big Game Hunter. It's not that much of a free roll anymore. It is a real cost, and it's a really clunky card if you don't have a target. So it's much more metagame dependent, but it's still very good, and especially in decks that do cycle a lot. Big Game Hunter will still be a very important part of their toolbox for dealing with big minions, and that won't change. Another card that people probably didn't see coming is Hunter's Mark, which is now changed. From a 0 mana, change a minion's health to 1, to a 1 mana, change a minion's health to 1. And it's not that huge a change. It's much like the Soulfire change, for example, where the mana cost for the spell was changed from 0 to 1 mana. And it's because it's a real cost now. It does cost you some tempo to be able to easily get rid of something. and that's probably okay. Hunters have been hit pretty hard with this series of nerfing, but Hunter's Mark is still not unplayable. We won't see hunters with double Hunter's Mark probably, but somewhat mid-range focused hunters, for example, that might have even run Big Game Hunter as an option, might just run 1 Hunter's Mark, or a Control Hunter deck, for which Hunter's Mark is also still an excellent card. So it's probably okay. It's a slight hit, especially to the faster Hunter decks. And this does mean, combined with the Big Game Hunter changes, that big minions are a lot more sturdy. People still have the ability to get rid of big minions, but there's a real cost associated with it. You are expected to give up some tempo in order to get rid of something huge for your opponent, and that's just expected, because your opponent probably invested some real effort into that minion. So another card that people really didn't see coming for this nerfing season is Blade Flurry. And this is a pretty big one. Blade Flurry used to say 2 mana, destroy your weapon, deal its damage to all enemies. And now it's 4 mana, destroy your weapon, and deal its damage to all enemy minions. Now this is a real point of contention here. People are not happy with this change. And people have already called this the next Warsong Commander, the next Buzzard. And this is pretty huge, because not only are we increasing the mana cost of a card by 2, we are also reducing the amount of damage it deals, because it no longer deals damage to your opponent. Mind you that if you compare this card to a card like Shadow Flame, which is 4 mana, destroy one of your minions, and deal its damage to all enemy minions, that's actually kind of comparable. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that this does open up the road for Blizzard to print more efficient rogue weapons, because we're actually kind of tired of seeing another what's the range thing in GVG called? I don't even remember, because no one played that thing. We have a Poison Blade, some really poor rogue weapons, some really poor rogue weapon enhancements. So it's not all that spectacular, and that is most of all because Blade Flurry exists. So we probably will see at least one copy of Blade Flurry in most rogue decks that also include Preparation and Deadly Poison. And I don't think we've seen the last of those cards. This is still a powerful card because for 4 mana and some setup time, let's not forget that, you are still able to clear your opponent's board. And if Rogue does not get any better board clear options, people will play Blade Flurry, and it will probably still work. Although you do have to mind your setup time, you have to probably equip a weapon on the turn before you Blade Flurry, and you probably have to Preparation before you Blade Flurry. But if you can set that up, and if you can have an Auctioneer on the table, or some kind of spell synergy like a Violet Teacher, this can still be a really powerful card, let's not forget that. But the amount of burst that will come from, for example, an Oil Rogue, which is no longer in Standard, of course, or a Goblin Auctioneer-based Rogue with probably Malagos or some kind of burst combo, it will be reduced, but this is by no means... I don't think we've seen the last of this card. Alright, next topic is powerful neutral minions. First of all, Knife Juggler. And this change will make some people really happy because they've seen enough of Knife Juggler for the past few months, few years even. Knife Juggler is a 2-mana 3/2 minion, and after you summon a minion, it deals 1 damage to a random minion, and it has now been changed to a 2-mana 2/2 minion. That means that rolling Knife Juggler into an aggressive deck, for example, is no longer a freebie. You want to use a 2-mana 2/2 with some actual synergy. So in Wild, we will see Knife Juggler in a deck that runs Muster for Battle, or in a slightly more slowish Hunter deck that runs Unleash the Hounds. In decks that summon multiple minions per turn, that can really benefit from this card. The moment they play it and then play some minions in the same turn. But it is no longer a very good aggressive minion, because coining out a Knife Juggler on turn 1, if your opponent does not respond to it, it will not deal 7 damage to your opponent by itself. If a rogue is forced to coin hero power, or to hero power, the rogue starts, does nothing on turn 1, you coin out a Knife Juggler, and then the rogue hero powers and hits the Knife Juggler. It is a real cost for the rogue to hit the Knife Juggler, but this will ease the pain somewhat. So as an aggressive deck, Knife Juggler is no longer a minion that you actually want to play on 2 mana. And that takes away an important option. It gives more options to other 2-mana 3/2 minions, 2-mana 2/3 minions. Flame Juggler, for example, is actually a real option that is already replacing Knife Juggler in some decks that are not based on spamming tokens. So it might even overtake it in those decks, and I don't hate that. There should be options in the 2-mana slot for aggressive decks. And if Knife Juggler is no longer the minion to go to there, that's fine. Let the decks that actually synergize with the Knife Juggler use the Knife Juggler. And that seems okay to me. We have a couple more cards to go. The first being Leper Gnome. Leper Gnome was changed from a 1-mana 2/1 minion to a 1-mana 1/1 minion, which has the death rattle, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. Basically the same thing as the Knife Juggler. Leper Gnome is probably, well, maybe good enough to keep in aggressive decks. Maybe, because it is still a minion that is likely to deal 3 damage over the course of its lifespan. 1 damage to either the enemy hero in case of a rogue or a druid, and then 2 mana when it dies to the enemy hero. Or it will deal its 1 damage to an enemy minion, or it will remove a divine shield from an Argent Squire. I was going to say a mini bot, but mini bot is no longer in standard. But you catch my drift. In a very aggressive deck, this might still be the minion of choice, because a very aggressive deck does not expect its minions to live very long. In decks that are less aggressive than the most aggressive of decks, decks that actually expect their minions to live for slightly longer, that expect their Leper Gnomes to be able to trade into opposing Knife Jugglers, for example, or, well, that might be a pipe dream, but into opposing 3/2s, or, yeah, so something like that. Those decks might want to look towards other minions. For example, Hybrid Hunter might want to look into Brave Archer, for example. Face Hunter probably still wants Leper Gnome because it doesn't expect its minions to live that long, and it might take 1 damage less, but that's probably okay because you're only expecting a 1 mana 2/1 to deal 2 damage anyway, and if this Leper Gnome here is a 1 mana 1/1 that deals 3 damage, then that's probably still fine because you're not expecting it to hit your opponent more than once. So it's, in that case, probably still better than a 1 mana 2/1. But slightly slower aggressive decks might start to look towards other 1 mana minions, like Worgen Infiltrator, for example. Face Hunter has already adapted that one. Or, like I said, Brave Archer, or in the case of Rogue Buccaneer, or there's plenty of other options. And yeah, like Blizzard is saying, they would like other 1 mana minions to be more compelling, and thus Leper Gnome is too good for aggressive decks, which is exactly the kind of deck that is actually looking for a 1 mana 2/1. So that's also fine. I'm curious to see what aggressive decks will come up with, because they're looking a bit samey. Every aggressive deck is running Leper Gnomes, and I would like to see some other minions. So yeah, I'm curious. Second to last card, if I remember correctly, is Arcane Golem, which is one of the more discussed cards also. It used to be a 3 mana 4/2 with charge, and Battlecry give your opponent a mana crystal. The Battlecry remains, give your opponent a mana crystal, but it no longer has charge. And to compensate for that, its health has been increased from 2 to 4. So it's now a 3 mana 4/4 with Battlecry, give your opponent a mana crystal. This card is probably useless now. And that's not an exaggeration. This is not a card you would like to run in, I think, any deck. Maybe very aggressive decks might still be interested in a 3 mana 4/4 with marginal downside if your opponent has no real use for its mana crystals, but it's not a card that you can reasonably drop on turn 3. So what am I even talking about? This is not a card you want to put in any deck. But the main question we should ask ourselves is how much worse are our alternatives? And the alternatives for Arcane Golem are usually cards like Leroy Jenkins, cards like Wolf Rider, perhaps even cards like Bluegill Warrior, if your intention is to play a charge minion and then put double buffs on it, use Abusive Sergeant, whatever it's called, and then copy it and smash face. That doesn't matter all that much. If you can use Bluegill Warrior, you can save a mana. You might not have to Emperor up your combo. Your combo is reduced by a little bit, but you're not really losing that much by losing Arcane Golem. You can definitely no longer run Arcane Golem in those decks, but you're not really losing that much, as long as your intention is to buff it up to huge amounts. The aggressive decks that run the Arcane Golem for its 3 mana deal 4 damage are out of luck. They will have to do with lesser alternatives like Wolf Rider, like Argent Horse Rider, that might be a little bit more sturdy but less bursty, and that's probably a good thing. So there might still be very impressive combos, but they become a little more convoluted, a little less explosive, and I would like to live in that world. So while Arcane Golem is unplayable, nobody really liked Arcane Golem anyway. They just like charge minions, and they will resort to the slightly less efficient charge minion instead of Arcane Golem. It's not like we're lacking alternatives here. Last card, actually not the last card, but we'll talk about the other one after this, is Molten Giant. And Molten Giant has been changed from a 20 mana 8/8 that costs 1 less for each damage your hero is taken to a 25 mana 8/8 that costs 1 less for each damage your hero has taken. So this means that that if you really want to play this card for basically free, you'll have to drop dangerously low. You can only play this card for free if you have 5 health remaining. That's really dangerous. That is really dangerous. Of course, with the nerfs to certain damage combos, dropping to low health is somewhat safer, and that makes Molten Giant better because it's safer to drop to the health totals that would allow you to play your Molten Giants for a reasonable mana cost. But a real thing to keep in mind here is that you can only play Molten Giants at 15 or less life now. So this nerf could never have happened without also nerfing Force of Nature, for example, because dropping to 15 health to play your Molten Giants is ridiculous when you have to keep in mind that your opponent can do 14 damage in one combo. That's that doesn't sound like the healthiest idea. But it should be safer to drop to lower health totals, but you will have to drop to lower health totals to actually play your Molten Giants. Molten Giants are not unplayable, and they will still be played. I don't know whether Handlock will actually run 2 Molten Giants, because they might rot in your hand a bit too often. And with Jiraxxus, this card is basically unplayable. If you drop Jiraxxus, your max health total is 15, so you can only play a Molten Giant when you... Am I saying this right? You can't play Molten Giants anymore. You would have to be dead to play your Molten Giants. So they will definitely rot in your hand. Well, you might be able to get away with playing a Molten Giant on 5 health before. So definitely worse for the Handlock decks. Molten Giant Echo Mage decks might still be a thing in Wild, and might not care too much about the mana cost increase, because Echo Mages were most of the time only playing this thing when they were nearly dead and protected by Ice Block anyway. So yeah, for them it probably doesn't matter, but that's not really a thing in Standard anymore, because Echo of Medivh no longer exists. You might still be able to duplicate. Oh, duplicate also rotates out. Never mind that. I don't think a giant mage deck is an actual thing in Standard in that case. But you never know what people come up with. So to the actual last card, which I almost forgot, Master of Disguise, which kind of expected nerf, because Blizzard has been alluding to the fact that Master of Disguise was preventing them from printing certain minions as a neutral card. For example, a card like Animated Armor, or a card like... well, I was going to say Dreadsteed, but that doesn't really apply. But an effect like Animated Armor cannot really be printed at neutral when you could give it permanent stealth. So giving your Auctioneer permanent stealth would be ridiculous, but no one's playing that. And Master of Disguise isn't breaking any formats, but it is preventing rather strong passive effects from being printed on minions that any class can use, or rogues can use. So if you can only give a friendly minion stealth until your next turn, which is the change that is coming, yeah, maybe we'll see more exciting neutral minions. That's probably interesting. I'm all for this change, because Master of Disguise wasn't ever used anyway. So, yeah, enjoy your free dust, basically. So, one thing I would like to mention here, and we might go back to the top for this, is what is missing here. And that's kind of interesting to talk about, because some cards were expected to be nerfed, but were not nerfed. For example, let's talk about Alexstrasza. What does it mean that Alexstrasza is still a thing? Will Freeze Mage still be rampant in our next standard season? Freeze Mage will, of course, lose Mad Scientist as a card. Will lose. Well, that's basically it, right? So, is the loss of Mad Scientist enough for Freeze Mage to lose enough efficiency that it won't run rampant? With also with the lack of burst from other classes now, I don't know. I can't see into the future, but it will be interesting to see. And that is one deck that we have to keep in mind for now. There's a couple of other cards that people would have liked to see nerfed. For example, Divine Favor is a card that has been mentioned a lot, and is a card that might be better if it were a little less efficient. But a thing to keep in mind again is that the decks where Divine Favor was played a lot are losing a lot of cards in Standard, and well, Aggro Paladin is not really breaking any records, winning any tournaments in our current Standard or Wild format. So. My guess here is that Blizzard is considering nerfing those cards, but they don't think it will be as bad as people think it will be. But if it will be, then I'm expecting nerfs within a reasonable time frame, and that could be soon TM. It could be after a few more tournaments. It might be a bad time if you're running into Aggro Paladins and Freeze Mages all the time. But let's not judge on that before we've seen the next Standard season with all these nerfs, as we've just discussed, and without having seen all the new cards that have yet to be revealed in the new set, which should be pretty damn soon. We're expecting most of the new set to be spoiled tomorrow, so that should be exciting. I'm really hoping for some exciting stuff there still. Let's not forget the sky is not falling. There's a whole new world to explore, and I'm excited for the new Standard season. So I hope you are too. Hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the Hearthstone nerfs. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.